Michael had stopped visiting the cemetery on her birthday 3 years ago, not because he had stopped grieving. Grief doesn't work that way, but because the silence had become too heavy to carry alone. His daughter, Emma, had been 5 years old when leukemia took her. She would have been 12 now. He tried not to calculate how many birthdays he had missed, how many seasons had passed without her laughter filling the house. The grave sat in the eastern corner of Riverside Cemetery, beneath an oak tree that had grown taller since they buried her. Michael remembered choosing that spot because Emma loved trees. She used to climb them in the backyard, her small hands gripping branches, her voice calling down to him, "Daddy, I can see the whole world from up here." That was before the hospital, before the white walls and the beeping machines and the moment he had to say goodbye. He had built a wall around that memory, brick by brick, until he couldn't feel it anymore. His wife had left 2 years after Emma's death. Grief had different rhythms for different people, she had said. Now Michael lived alone in a house too large, worked in an office too quiet, and existed in the spaces between people who still had their children. But today was different. Today, Michael received a letter at work, forwarded by a colleague who didn't recognize the handwriting. The envelope was cream-colored, sealed with care. Inside was a drawing, a child's drawing, rendered in colored pencil and marker. It showed a little girl with golden hair standing beneath a tree, and beside her, a figure in shadow. At the bottom, in careful handwriting, "Emma wanted you to know she's not forgotten." Michael's hands began to tremble. Chapter 1. The envelope. The office fell away. Michael sat in his cubicle, the drawing trembling in his hands, and felt something crack inside him, something that had been sealed for so long he had forgotten it was there. The drawing was recent. The colors were bright, almost luminous. Someone had taken time with this, had thought about Emma, had imagined her standing beneath that oak tree with deliberate care. The shadow figure, was it him? Was it meant to be him? He turned the envelope over again. No return address, no signature other than the words at the bottom of the drawing. Postmarked 3 days ago from the city. That was all. Michael read the sentence again, each word landing like a stone dropped into still water. Emma wanted you to know she's not forgotten. The handwriting belonged to a woman, or a girl old enough to write with precision. Someone who knew Emma's name. Someone who had been to the cemetery, had seen the grave, had thought about a child buried beneath an oak tree. He pulled out his phone before he could think better of it, and dialed the main office number. "Sarah, this letter that came for me today. Do you remember who it was from? Did anyone deliver it?" "It was in the morning batch," Sarah said, her voice uncertain. "A woman, I think. She asked to make sure it got to you personally. I'm sorry, I should have asked more questions, but we were busy and she seemed, I don't know, sad maybe, like it was important." "What did she look like?" "Honestly, Michael, I don't really remember. She was quiet. She wore a dark coat. I think she had dark hair. I'm sorry. I'm not being very helpful." He thanked her and hung up. For the rest of the afternoon, he could not focus on work. He kept the drawing on his desk, propped against his computer monitor, and every few minutes he found himself staring at it. The more he looked, the more he noticed details. The texture of the tree bark rendered in soft browns and greens, the way the girl's hair caught light, the small flowers blooming around the tree's base. Someone had spent hours on this. That evening, Michael drove to Riverside Cemetery for the first time in 3 years. The gate was locked at dusk, but he had climbed the fence before. His body moved through the motions automatically, his feet knowing the path even in the fading light. The oak tree stood exactly where his memory held it, larger now, its branches reaching higher into the darkening sky. The grave was covered with flowers, not just 1 or 2, but dozens, fresh flowers carefully arranged, Roses, lilies, daisies, and small wildflowers he couldn't name. They were placed with intention, some pressed into the earth, others arranged in small clusters. A stuffed animal sat at the base of the headstone, worn soft from handling. A children's book, a drawing pinned beneath a stone. Michael knelt down and pulled out the pinned drawing with trembling hands. It was similar to the one in his office, but different, older perhaps. It showed the same girl, the same tree, but in this one she was laughing, her head thrown back. There were dates on the back, monthly entries spanning 3 years. Michael sat in the grass beside his daughter's grave and wept, not the dry, silent tears of solitude, but the kind that came from being found. Chapter 2. The Vigil. For the next 2 weeks, Michael returned to the cemetery every evening. The flowers changed. Some wilted and were replaced, others were added as new arrangements. The stuffed animals rotated, a bear 1 week, a rabbit the next, each one worn and loved. Small cards appeared, written in the same careful handwriting. Emma, today I thought about you at the park. And Emma, you would have loved this book. And Emma, I'm still here. Michael began to document everything. He photographed each arrangement, each card, trying to piece together a pattern. The handwriting was consistent, the same person, he was sure now. The flowers suggested knowledge. Lilies on what would have been Emma's birthday, daisies throughout summer, chrysanthemums in autumn. Someone was not just visiting, someone was keeping careful track of time. He tried to access the cemetery's visitor logs, but they didn't keep such records. He asked the groundskeeper if he had seen anyone leaving flowers regularly, but the old man only shook his head. People leave flowers all the time, he said. Some folks remember their dead better than others. Michael became obsessed with the mystery. He drove past the cemetery at different times, early morning, mid-afternoon, late evening, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was tending Emma's grave. He found nothing but the evidence of her care. Fresh water in the small vase at the headstone, dirt carefully smoothed around the flowers, the spaces kept clean and peaceful. He read the cards again and again, searching for clues. The handwriting revealed a person of patience and attention. The flower choices showed knowledge of meaning, white lilies for sympathy, yellow daisies for innocence. The drawings grew more sophisticated as the stack accumulated. Each one showed Emma in different scenarios, at a playground, in a library, by the ocean, in a garden. In each image, the shadow figure was present but distant, always watching, never fully formed. Who were you, Michael wondered? Who was keeping vigil over his daughter's grave when he couldn't? One evening, he left a note of his own, placed carefully beside the flowers. If you're reading this, please know that I see what you're doing. Emma's father wants to thank you. Please, I need to understand. I need to know why. He returned the next evening and found the note gone. In its place was a new drawing and a sealed envelope with his name written on it. With shaking fingers, he opened it. I knew Emma, the letter began. I'm sorry I didn't know you were still visiting. I thought you had forgotten. I thought someone needed to remember her so that she wouldn't become only a name on a stone. I didn't expect you to find out. Please don't be angry. I was only trying to help. The letter was unsigned, but at the bottom a single sentence. I'm the reason Emma was ever born. Chapter 3. The question. Michael read the letter 100 times that night, and each reading unveiled new impossibilities. I'm the reason Emma was ever born. The sentence defied logic, yet it promised explanation. Someone was claiming, what? Involvement in Emma's conception, credit for her existence? Or was it something else entirely, a person who had guided him toward her mother, who had played some unseen role in the sequence of events that led to her birth? His mind spiraled through possibilities, each one more improbable than the last. He tried to think logically. Who would have this kind of knowledge about Emma? Who would care enough to visit her grave monthly, yearly, for 3 years with such meticulous devotion? By midnight, he had convinced himself that he was misinterpreting the letter. Perhaps it was from someone who had known the hospital staff during Emma's treatment. Perhaps it was a nurse who had cared for her, someone who had formed an attachment and felt responsibility for her memory. But that didn't explain the phrase about Emma's birth. Or perhaps the letter was from his ex-wife. Perhaps she was reaching out, trying to communicate through flowers and drawings because words had failed them both. The handwriting could belong to her. He tried to remember if her script had ever looked like this, but grief had stolen those details. Michael didn't sleep. He drove back to the cemetery in the pre-dawn darkness and sat by Emma's grave, the letter in his lap. The drawings spread across the grass beside him. "Who are you?" he whispered to the empty morning. "Why are you doing this?" The cemetery was silent, except for the sound of birds beginning their morning songs. The oak tree stood over the grave like a guardian, its branches just beginning to turn gold with the coming autumn. He made a decision. He would wait. That evening, Michael parked his car outside the cemetery gates and settled in to watch. He brought a thermos of coffee and his phone, prepared to sit through the night if necessary. The autumn air was cool, carrying the scent of turning leaves. Around him, the city moved on. Traffic passed, people went about their lives, the world continued its indifference to his vigil. At 7:47 p.m., a woman walked through the cemetery gates. She was perhaps in her 30s, Michael thought, though the fading light made it difficult to be certain. She wore a dark coat, as Sarah had described, and carried a small canvas bag. Her hair was dark and pulled back, and even from a distance Michael could see that she moved with purpose, following a path she had walked many times before. He remained in his car, watching as she made her way to Emma's grave. He saw her kneel beside the headstone, saw her reach into the canvas bag and withdraw flowers, autumn roses, golden and deep red. With careful hands, she arranged them among the flowers already present. Then she pulled out a small drawing and pinned it beneath a stone, just as she had done dozens of times before. She sat there for nearly an hour, perfectly still, her head bowed. Michael watched her shoulders rise and fall, though he couldn't determine if she was crying. The intimacy of the moment made him feel like an intruder, yet he couldn't look away. As the sky deepened toward darkness, she stood, brushed grass from her knees, and turned to leave. Michael had to make a choice: stay hidden, or step forward and answer the question that had consumed him. He opened the car door. "Comment where you're watching from. These stories of kindness connect hearts across the world." Chapter 4. The Recognition. "Excuse me," Michael called out, his voice uncertain after hours of silence. The woman stopped. She turned slowly, as if she already knew who he was, as if she had been expecting this moment. In the dim light of early evening, Michael could see her face more clearly now, and something about it triggered a memory he couldn't quite grasp. A ghost of a moment, a face half remembered from another lifetime. "You're Emma's father," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. And you." Michael stepped closer, trying to place her. "I know you somehow. I'm certain I do." The woman's eyes filled with tears. She looked down at her hands, then back at him. "My name is Sarah. I am in a different way now. But I was the nurse who delivered Emma." Michael's mind refused the information at first. He had seen the nurse who delivered Emma countless times during the pregnancy and birth, a kind woman with steady hands and a calm voice. But that was over a decade ago. This woman looked completely different to him now, though as he stared, he began to see traces of that younger person in her face. "You left the hospital," Michael heard himself say, "after Emma was born. You transferred somewhere else. You just disappeared from our lives. I did, Sarah said quietly. I had to. Because I had done something that no nurse should ever do. I had become too attached to a patient. I had broken protocols and professional boundaries. When I realized that I needed to leave, when I understood that my presence was becoming unhealthy for everyone involved, I transferred to another hospital. She paused, watching his face to see if he understood. But I never forgot Emma, she continued. I never stopped thinking about her. After she passed, I found out about it through the hospital network, though I wasn't supposed to know. And something broke inside me. This child I had held when she was minutes old, this beautiful, perfect child that I had helped bring into the world. She was gone. So you started leaving flowers, Michael said, understanding beginning to dawn on him. For 3 years, you've been coming here, leaving flowers and drawings. I didn't know what else to do, Sarah said. I thought that if I tended her grave, if I kept her memory alive with flowers and art, then she wouldn't be completely forgotten. I thought that if I did this quietly without anyone knowing, I could honor the gift of having been present at her birth. I never expected that you would stop coming. I thought you were still here, visiting regularly, and I was just supplementing your grief, adding to it, keeping her alive in the way a stranger could. Michael felt the pieces of the mystery assembling into a shape he hadn't anticipated. The letter you sent me, about being the reason Emma was born. What did you mean by that? Sarah took a breath. I was the nurse who convinced your wife to continue the pregnancy when she was considering termination at 20 weeks. The ultrasound had shown possible complications. She was terrified. I spent 3 hours holding her hand and talking to her about hope, about how many of these complications resolve, about how precious the life inside her was. I told her my own story. I had been born with complications that doctors said would be severe, and here I was, healthy and whole. I gave her hope when she needed it most. Her voice trembled. In a very real way, my presence in that moment contributed to Emma's birth. Without those words, without that hope I offered, Emma might never have existed. I didn't know then that I should have kept a professional distance. I didn't know that I would lose the ability to let her go. Michael stood silently for a long moment. He thought about the fragility of chance, about how every moment was built on the decisions of others, about how a stranger's kindness could echo through a lifetime. Thank you, he finally said. Thank you for being there for her. Thank you for not letting her be forgotten. For the first time in years, Michael didn't feel alone in his grief. Chapter 5. The vigil becomes 2. After that evening, Michael and Sarah began visiting the cemetery together. They would arrive on different days at first, Michael learning her schedule, Sarah learning his. They slowly began to synchronize their visits until eventually they fell into a rhythm, sometimes coming on the same evening, sitting side by side in the gathering darkness. They spoke little at first. Words seemed inadequate in the presence of Emma's grave, insufficient to bridge the gap between their different griefs. Michael's was the grief of a parent, sharp and primary. Sarah's was the grief of a witness, complicated by professional responsibility and personal attachment, layered with guilt and devotion. But slowly, as the autumn progressed and the leaves around the oak tree turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson, they began to share stories. Michael told her about Emma's last days in the hospital, how she had been brave in the way only children can be, how she'd asked questions about death that he couldn't answer, how she'd held his hand even as the medications made her drowsy. He spoke about the months after, when he had wanted to run away from the house because every room echoed with her absence. He talked about how he had stopped going to the cemetery because the grief had felt too massive to carry to that place where she was physically closest to him. Sarah spoke about the moment she delivered Emma, how Emma had emerged into the world with her eyes open, alert and aware, as if she was already discovering the universe around her. She described the weight of Emma in her hands, the perfection of her fingers and toes, the way Emma had looked at her with that ancient infant wisdom. She talked about watching Emma grow through the lens of medical checkups and appointments, about the way her heart had broken when Emma was diagnosed with leukemia, about feeling helpless to protect a child who had somehow become precious to her despite all her training and professional boundaries. "I wasn't supposed to love her," Sarah said one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was supposed to care for her as a nurse cares for any patient, professionally, distantly, but from the moment she was born, I loved her like she was my own." Michael reached over and took Sarah's hand. They sat like that as darkness fell completely, as the stars emerged above the cemetery, as the world around them continued on, indifferent to their shared mourning. In the weeks that followed, they planted new flowers together at Emma's grave, perennials that would return each spring, a living memorial that would persist beyond their visits. They created a small stone marker beside the headstone with Emma's favorite quote, something she had said once while lying in the hospital bed: "The sky is beautiful even when it rains." Michael asked Sarah to help him organize Emma's drawings and artwork. They created a portfolio of her creations, her sketches, her paintings, her early attempts at writing stories. Together, they worked to preserve her memory, not through the numbing pain of loss, but through the documentation of a life lived, however briefly. And then one evening, Michael brought Sarah back to the house where he and Emma had lived. He had kept Emma's room exactly as it was when she died, her books on the shelf, her stuffed animals arranged on the bed, her drawings taped to the walls. He hadn't been able to change anything, and he had been ashamed of this, thinking it meant he was stuck, unable to move forward. Sarah walked through the room slowly, looking at each drawing, each toy, each artifact of Emma's short life. When she reached Emma's bed, she sat down carefully on the edge, as if afraid to disturb something sacred. "She lived so fully," Sarah said. "Even with everything she endured, she lived with so much joy. Do you see that?" Michael did see it. For the first time, he saw it not as a tragedy cut short, but as a life fully realized, a spirit that had blazed brightly, leaving marks on everyone she touched. "I think," Sarah said carefully, "I think Emma would want us to know that what we're doing, tending her memory, keeping her alive through art and flowers and stories, this is how she continues to live. Not just as a grave we visit, but as a presence in our lives, as someone who is still teaching us, still changing us." Michael felt something shift inside him. The weight of grief didn't lighten, but it changed shape. It became less like a stone he was carrying and more like a garden he was tending. Chapter 6. The Gift of Continuity. 6 months after that first evening in the cemetery, Michael and Sarah decided to create something permanent for Emma. They started a scholarship fund in her name, a small fund, modest in scope, but deeply intentional. The scholarship would be awarded each year to a student who was battling a serious illness while trying to continue their education. It would provide financial support, yes, but more importantly, it would send a message. You are not forgotten. Your fight matters. Your dreams are worth protecting. Sarah used her connections from the hospital to help identify deserving candidates. Michael contributed half of his annual savings. Together, they worked through the bureaucratic requirements, the paperwork, the documentation necessary to make it official. The Emma Grace Memorial Scholarship became a reality, and with it, a way to channel their grief into something generative. The first recipient was a 16-year-old girl named Marcus, who was undergoing chemotherapy while trying to maintain her grades. Michael and Sarah met with her, heard her story, and watched her face light up when she learned she had been selected. "This means I don't have to give up," Marcus said. This means someone believes I can make it. Michael saw Emma in that moment, not as a ghost haunting their grief, but as a presence extending forward into the future, touching lives they would never fully know, creating possibilities that wouldn't have existed without her. In the spring, they planted a memorial garden at a local children's hospital, a quiet garden with benches and flowers and a small plaque that read, "In memory of Emma Grace, may all who sit here know that they are loved and remembered." The garden became a place where sick children and their families could find a moment of peace, a place where grief could rest in the presence of growing things. Sarah had requested a transfer to this hospital, and now she worked part-time in their oncology ward. She had told Michael about her decision one evening by Emma's grave, her voice steady and certain. "I spent so long running from my attachment to Emma, running from the pain of it," she had said. "But I think now that running away was the wrong response. I think I was meant to work with sick children. I think my love for Emma, even when it was painful and complicated, was preparation for a life of serving kids and families in crisis." Michael watched her move through this new work with a grace and compassion that seemed to touch everyone around her. Parents told him stories of how Sarah had sat with their children through their worst moments, how she had held their hands and spoken to them with the kind of tenderness that came from genuine understanding of loss. If this story has already touched your heart, hit the like button. It helps the message of compassion reach more people who need hope. Chapter 7. The Letter from Marcus. In August, Michael received a letter from Marcus. She was now cancer-free, in remission for 6 months, and starting her senior year of high school with a new lease on life. She had learned about Emma's story from Sarah, and she wanted Michael to know what that story meant to her. "When I was at my lowest point," Marcus wrote, "when I was in the hospital bed thinking about giving up, Sarah told me about a little girl named Emma who had faced what I was facing. She told me about how Emma's father and Emma's nurse had created something beautiful from her memory. She told me that Emma's life, though brief, was continuing to matter to people she had never met. She told me that my life, though threatened, could also continue to matter, could also extend into the future and touch other people. I want you to know that because of Emma, I decided to keep fighting. Because of what you and Sarah are doing, I believed I had something worth fighting for. Emma saved my life in a way. Your daughter saved my life." Michael wept when he read this letter. He showed it to Sarah, and they sat together on Emma's grave, holding the letter between them, understanding finally that grief transformed into action becomes hope. That a child's short life, remembered with love and transformed into service, could ripple outward indefinitely, touching lives in ways they could never fully comprehend. They created copies of Marcus's letter and placed them in a small box at the memorial garden. Over the next months, other people began adding their own letters, other patients Sarah had worked with, their families, people who had learned about the Emma Grace Scholarship and wanted to express what it meant to them. The box filled slowly but steadily, becoming a record of how Emma's memory was actively healing the world. Michael sometimes brought visitors to the cemetery now. He told Emma's story to friends who had experienced loss, to colleagues who were struggling with grief, to anyone who needed to know that sorrow could be transformed into something generative. He no longer felt like he was carrying his pain alone. He was sharing it, and in the sharing, watching it multiply and extend and reach toward people he would never meet. Sarah had moved into the small guest room of Michael's house. It had happened gradually. First she was staying over after particularly emotional cemetery visits, then staying for long weekends. Then eventually it seemed obvious that she shouldn't have a separate apartment when so much of her life was intertwined with his, with Emma's memory, with the work they were doing together. They weren't romantic partners. though sometimes Michael wondered if they might become something like that eventually. For now, they were something more complex and perhaps more profound. Two people bound together by a child they had both loved in different ways. Two people who had learned how to transform grief into purpose. One evening, sitting by Emma's grave, as they did several times each week now, Sarah asked Michael a question that had been building for months. "Do you still feel angry about Emma, about the unfairness of it?" Michael considered this carefully. "Not angry," he finally said. "Sad, yes, always sad, but not angry anymore. I think anger requires the belief that things could have been different, that we were wronged and owed something better. And I still believe that, in some fundamental way, Emma deserved to live longer, to have a full life. But I've also come to understand that her life, brief as it was, wasn't wasted. She mattered. She still matters. And maybe that's not fair compensation for a childhood cut short. But it's something. It's evidence that she lived." Sarah nodded, and they sat in the comfortable silence that had developed between them. The kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled with words. Chapter 8. The cycle continues. 3 years after finding the first mysterious envelope, Michael stood at a different grave. An older woman, someone he had met at the memorial garden, had passed away suddenly of a heart attack. She had been a volunteer in the garden for over a year, and her family had asked Michael to speak at her memorial service. He had talked about how grief connects people, about how loss can be transformed into service, about how the most meaningful legacies come not from grand gestures, but from quiet, consistent acts of love. After the service, her daughter approached him. "My mother loved working in Emma's memorial garden," she said. "She told me it was the first place she felt peaceful after my father died. She said knowing that other people's pain was being honored, there made her own pain feel less isolating. She asked me to plant flowers there every month in her name. Would that be acceptable?" Michael felt the circle expanding. He thought about his own grief, how isolated it had been. For those 3 years he didn't visit the cemetery. He thought about how Sarah had kept the vigil alone, how lonely that must have been, and how the moment they found each other, the loneliness had transformed into something shared and bearable. "Of course," he said, "your mother's legacy will be exactly what she would want it to be, part of something larger than her grief, connected to other people's losses, part of a community of memory." In the months that followed, the memorial garden grew. More people began leaving flowers, tending to it, treating it as a sacred space. Local teenagers adopted it as a place where they came to process their own losses. Elderly people brought their grandchildren to show them how to honor memory through tending living things. The garden became a hub of quiet grief and shared remembrance. Michael had taken early retirement from his job. Instead, he and Sarah began working full-time on expanding the Emma Grace Memorial initiatives. They created a program that trained volunteers to work in hospitals with families dealing with life-threatening illnesses in children. They developed a curriculum that helped children process fear and grief through art and nature. They wrote a book about their journey, which became a small bestseller in grief counseling circles. But perhaps the most important work they did was the quietest. Michael and Sarah continued to visit Emma's grave twice a week. They continued to tend it with flowers and art. They continued to sit by the oak tree and talk about the living world, about how they were changing, about what they were learning from the privilege of keeping a child's memory alive. Sarah had become pregnant, not through any deliberate biological path, but through the adoption process. A foster child named Leo, aged 7, had come into their lives during a particularly vulnerable moment in his own journey. Michael and Sarah had been asked to provide temporary shelter while permanent arrangements were being made. But temporary had stretched into weeks and then months, and eventually they had petitioned to adopt him. Leo knew about Emma from the beginning. Michael had told him the story when they first met, the story of his daughter and how she had taught him that love continues even after someone is gone. Leo had listened with the grave attention of a child who had already experienced his own losses, and when Michael finished, Leo had asked, "Can I help take care of Emma's grave?" So now, the three of them visited the cemetery together on Sunday mornings. Michael and Sarah would tend the grave with deliberate care, while Leo ran around the oak tree, laughing, alive with the kind of unself-conscious joy that reminded them both what they were protecting through their work, the right of children to live, to grow, to leave marks on the world. Chapter 9. The flowering. A decade after that first mysterious envelope, the Emma Grace Foundation had expanded beyond anything Michael had initially imagined. The scholarship program had helped over 50 young people continue their education while fighting serious illnesses. The hospital volunteer program had been adopted by 12 different children's hospitals across the state. The Memorial Garden had inspired similar projects in 5 other cities. The book had reached thousands of grieving people, offering them a model for how to transform their pain into purpose. But the heart of everything remained the same: an old cemetery, an oak tree, and a grave marked with a simple stone. Michael was 49 years old now. His hair had grayed at the temples. The lines around his eyes had deepened, less from sorrow than from the kind of smiling that came from genuine peace. Sarah, beside him, looked similarly aged by life, and also similarly transformed. Her face carried lines of thoughtfulness and compassion that hadn't existed in that younger version of herself, who had torn herself away from this place in shame and pain. Leo, now 17, had become involved in the Foundation's work in a way that surprised them both. He had started a peer support group for foster children, helping other kids navigate the particular isolation of living in temporary families. His story, abandoned by his biological parents, cycled through the system, and ultimately adopted by 2 people grieving a child they had lost, had become a powerful testimony about how broken systems of care could be healed by people willing to remain present. On the 10th anniversary of Michael and Sarah's discovery of each other, they organized a small gathering at the cemetery. Marcus, the young woman whose life the scholarship had helped save, came with her 2-year-old daughter. Several other scholarship recipients attended, along with some of the foster children Leo worked with, and representatives from the hospitals where Sarah had implemented her volunteer training program. They gathered around Emma's grave as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. Michael held Leo's hand. Sarah stood slightly apart, her head bowed in the posture of private prayer that had become familiar to him over the years. "I want to tell you all about Emma," Michael began, his voice steady and clear. "About a little girl who lived 5 years on this earth and whose impact continues to expand every single day. Emma never knew she would touch so many lives. She never knew that the pain of her illness would eventually lead to the healing of others. She just lived her life, fully and courageously, in the way children do when they haven't yet learned to limit their hope or their love." He looked around the circle at the faces gathered, people of all ages, all backgrounds, all united by having been touched by the ripples emanating from one small child's life. "When I thought Emma was forgotten," Michael continued, "when I had stopped visiting her grave because the pain was too immense to carry, Sarah was here. Sarah was keeping the vigil. Sarah was refusing to let the world forget. And when I discovered that Sarah was tending Emma's grave, I learned something essential, that love continues, that memory is an action, not a passive thing, that the way we honor those we've lost is by taking what they've taught us and extending it into the world, toward people we may never meet." He paused, looking down at Emma's headstone, at the name carved into stone that had become a gateway through which so much beauty had poured forth. "Emma used to say that the sky was beautiful even when it rains," Michael said. I think what she meant was that sorrow and beauty exist together, that grief and joy can coexist, that even the darkest moments carry the seeds of something transformative if we have the courage to tend those seeds. As the sun finished its descent and darkness gathered around the cemetery, they left the flowers they had brought, dozens of blooms in colors that seemed to glow against the deepening blue of evening. The oak tree stood over them all, ancient and patient, having witnessed 10 years of love's persistent work. Epilogue. In the morning light, the flowers looked like promises kept. Subscribe for more stories of love, courage, and redemption. Thank you for watching the story of He Thought His Child Was Forgotten until he discovered who was keeping her memory living. Let's keep spreading the light.